Hello, and welcome to Black History Matters 2025. Today, we will discuss two significant movements in the fight for civil rights: the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, and the Niagara Movement. These two organizations played a central role in challenging racial injustice in the United States, laying a foundation for the modern civil rights movement, especially how it will be fought for through legal systems throughout the 20th century. While both of them are relatively well known, delving deeper into their histories will illuminate the ways in which the origins of these organizations, which will have a long lasting impact like the NAACP, would continue to fight for civil rights up until this day. The birth of the NAACP. The NAACP was founded on February 12, 1909, in New York City, as a direct response to the race riots in Springfield, Illinois, in 1908. The Springfield Race Riot of 1908 was a violent outbreak of racial hatred in Springfield, Illinois, fueled by long-standing racial tensions and false accusations against black residents. The riot began on August 14, 1908, when a white mob, angered by reports that a black man had assaulted a white woman, gathered to demand their lynchings. When authorities moved the accused men out of town for their safety, the mob turned its fury on the black community, attacking homes and businesses in predominantly black neighborhoods. Over the course of 2 days, white rioters lynched at least two black men, burned down black-owned businesses, and forced hundreds of black residents to flee the city. The violence shocked the nation, especially because it occurred in the hometown of Abraham Lincoln, a symbol of emancipation. A group of black and white progressives, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Mary White Ovington, Henry Moskowitz, and Oswald Garrison Bayard, came together to form the NAACP. Their goal was to fight for racial justice through legal challenges and public awareness campaigns. They believed that the courts could be used to dismantle institutional racism, especially the Jim Crow laws that enforced segregation and discrimination. W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells were two of the most influential black activists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and their backgrounds made their leadership in the NAACP a natural extension of their lifelong fights for racial justice. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, a relatively tolerant community where he had access to education and little direct experience with racism in his early years. He later became the first black man to earn a PhD from Harvard and studied in Germany, where he was exposed to a broader world of intellectual thought. However, upon returning to the United States, he encountered the harsh realities of systemic racism and segregation, which fueled his commitment to racial uplift through education, political activism, and direct challenge to white supremacy. His 1903 work, The Souls of Black Folk, argued against the accommodationist approach of Booker T. Washington, and instead called for black Americans to demand full civil rights. His frustration with the limitations placed on black progress led him to help him found the Niagara Movement in 1905, which later evolved into the NAACP in 1909. Du Bois' background as an academic and intellectual made him a driving force in the NAACP's efforts to use legal challenges and public advocacy to secure racial justice. Ida B. Wells, born into slavery in 1862 in Mississippi, had a much different but equally powerful journey into activism. She was deeply shaped by the violent realities of the post-Reconstruction South, especially the terror of lynching. As a journalist, she launched an investigative campaign in the 1890s, exposing the truth behind lynchings, revealing that they were often used not to punish crimes, but to control and terrorize black communities. Her fearless reporting and activism led to threats on her life, forcing her to move from the South to Chicago, where she continued her fight for justice. Wells' direct action approach, boycotts, speaking tours, and investigative journalism aligned with the NAACP's goals of exposing racial violence and demanding federal anti-lynching laws. Though she was initially sidelined by some NAACP leaders, particularly because of gender discrimination, her foundational work in anti-lynching activism heavily influenced the organization's priorities. Both Du Bois and Wells brought unique strengths to the NAACP, Du Bois as a scholar and strategist, and Wells as a journalist and grassroots organizer. Their backgrounds helped shape the organization's mission combining intellectual activism with direct confrontation of racial injustice. One of the NAACP's earliest victory was in 1915 when the Supreme Court ruled in Ginn v. United States. The Ginn versus United States Supreme Court case in 1915 was a landmark decision that struck down grandfather clauses used to disenfranchise black voters, particularly in Oklahoma and other southern states. The case specifically challenged an amendment to Oklahoma's voting laws that imposed literacy tests but allowed exemptions for those whose grandfathers had been eligible to vote before January 1st, 1866. This effectively disenfranchised black voters, as their ancestors had been enslaved and therefore ineligible to vote before the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. The NAACP challenged the legality of the Oklahoma law, marking one of its earliest legal victories in the fight against racial discrimination in the South. The organization supported the federal government's case against the law by publicizing the issue. In 1915, the Supreme Court ruled that Oklahoma's grandfather clause violated the 15th Amendment, which prohibits racial discrimination in voting. While the ruling was a victory for civil rights, Southern states quickly adapted by implementing other voter suppression tactics, such as poll taxes and white primaries. Poll taxes and white primaries were two methods used to disenfranchise black voters in the United States, particularly in the South after Reconstruction. Poll taxes required individuals to pay a fee in order to vote, which disproportionately affected black Americans and poor white voters, who often could not afford the cost. These taxes were often cumulative, meaning that if someone had missed a previous election, they had to pay for all past years to regain the right to vote. On the other hand, white primaries were a tactic used by the Democratic Party in the South to exclude black voters from primary elections. Since the Democratic Party dominated Southern politics, winning the primary was often equivalent to winning the general election. By barring black citizens from participating in these crucial elections, white primaries effectively denied them a voice in government. Both practices were designed to circumvent the 15th Amendment and maintain white political control until they were eventually ruled unconstitutional in the mid-20th century. Nonetheless, Ginn versus United States demonstrated the effectiveness of legal challenges in dismantling racist policies, a strategy that the NAACP would continue to use in later cases like Brown versus Board of Education. The NAACP would go on to assist in even bigger civil rights ambitions, such as the desegregation of schools with the 1914 Brown versus Board of Education decision. Brown versus Board of Education was a landmark Supreme Court case that ruled racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, overturning the separate but equal doctrine established in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, an earlier landmark Supreme Court case. The case was a consolidation of multiple lawsuits filed by black families across different states, challenging the unequal and inferior education facilities provided to black students. The NAACP helped organize and argue the case, with its legal defense fund led by Thurgood Marshall spearheading the legal strategy. The NAACP gathered extensive evidence demonstrating the psychological and educational harm caused by segregation, including testimony from social scientists like Kenneth and Mamie Clark, whose research on the negative effects of segregation on black children influenced the court's decisions. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, ruled that segregation in public education violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This victory was a major milestone in the civil rights movement and set the legal foundation for future challenges to racial segregation and discrimination in other spaces like the workplace. All this goes to show the centrality of the NAACP in the civil rights movement. Now a bit on the Niagara Movement, which was actually the precursor of the NAACP. The Niagara Movement was a black civil rights organization founded in 1905 by W.E.B. Du Bois and a group of like-minded individuals who opposed the gradualist approach to racial equality advocated by Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was a prominent Black American educator, author, and leader. Born into slavery in 1856 in Virginia, Washington rose to prominence through education, eventually becoming the first leader of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He believed that Black Americans could achieve social and economic progress through vocational education and economic self-sufficiency, rather than direct confrontation over civil rights. His gradualist approach, often called the Atlanta Compromise, after a speech he gave in 1895, emphasized accommodation to segregation and racial discrimination while encouraging Black Americans to focus on developing skills, economic independence, and self-improvement. He argued that once Black Americans proved their economic value to society, racial equality would naturally follow. While this approach gained support from many white leaders and some Black communities, it was criticized by figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed that Washington's strategy was too passive and failed to demand immediate civil rights and full equality. The Niagara Movement was launched after Du Bois and 28 other Black intellectuals and activists met secretly at Niagara Falls, Ontario, because they were denied accommodations on the United States side due to segregation. The Niagara Movement aimed to demand full civil rights, political representation, and economic opportunities for Black Americans, rejecting Washington's emphasis on vocational training and accommodation to segregation. The organization called for an end to racial discrimination, the enforcement of voting rights, and equal access to education. Although it never gained mass support and eventually dissolved by 1910, the Niagara Movement laid the foundation for the creation of the NAACP, which ended up absorbing many of its members. A document titled Niagara Movement Declaration of Principles 1905 was created during these meetings. If you want to read the full thing, I have linked it in the video description. The declaration emphasized key principles of the Niagara Movement, including the right to vote, equal educational opportunities, fair treatment in the justice system, and an end to racial discrimination in public accommodations and employment. It called for the enforcement of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and condemned segregation, lynching, and disenfranchisement. The Niagara Movement insisted that Black Americans should not have to prove their worth through economic success alone, but should be granted their full rights as American citizens. This document opens with a clear statement of the Niagara Movement's standing. Quote, Progress. The members of the conference, known as the Niagara Movement, congratulate the Black Americans on certain undoubted evidences of progress in the last decade, particularly the increase of intelligence, the buying of property, the checking of crime, the uplift in home life, and the advancement in literature and art, and the demonstration of constructive and executive ability in the conduct of greater religious, economic, and educational institutions. End quote. Additionally, they go on to speak on the need for continued progress in places like commerce, education, and suffrage. For example, on suffrage, they say, quote, Suffrage. At the same time, we believe that this class of American citizens should protest emphatically and continue against the curtailment of their political rights. We believe in manhood suffrage. We believe that no man is so good, intelligent, or wealthy as to be entrusted wholly with the welfare of his neighbor. End quote. Overall, the Niagara Movement was a bold and uncompromising stance against racial oppression, setting the stage for the NAACP's long-term fight for civil rights. As I mentioned, many Niagara Movement members went on to help found the NAACP, ensuring that their demands for justice would continue through a more structured and influential organization. The NAACP, in turn, became one of the most effective civil rights organizations in American history, leading legal battles, organizing protests, and advocating for legislative change. Even today, the NAACP continues to fight against racial inequality, proving that the efforts of the Niagara Movement and the early NAACP leaders were not in vain. Understanding the Niagara Movement and the NAACP allows us to see how Black activists first began to organize themselves for the long fight for justice dignity, and equality at the beginning of the 20th century. These organizations remind us that the civil rights advancements that we saw in the 20th century did not happen overnight. They were the result of decades of dedicated struggle. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Black History Matters 2025. Be sure to check out our upcoming videos as we continue to explore overlooked stories from Black American history. The next video will be available on Monday, February 24th on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to leave any feedback on this particular video or the program, the link on your screen will take you to a survey where you can leave this feedback. The survey is also linked in the video description. You're also more than welcome to contact the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum at the contact info on your screen, or to leave a comment in the comment section below. Thank you.